The patrons have spoken, and this time we have Noctowl. Not long since trainers set off into the wondrous world of Johto, whether that was in Gold and Silver or the remakes a decade later, they would soon encounter a Hoot Hoot, but only at night, beautifully illustrating one of the main features of the day and night system first introduced in Generation 2. Not long after, they'd see Hoot Hoot become a Noctowl. Ash also had a Noctowl in the anime, a shiny one at that. It was the first shiny Pokemon to appear in the anime, in fact. Today we're going to examine Noctowl's existence in the competitive scene. Did it shine as bright as the day it slept through, or was its history noir level dark? We investigate as we ask, how good was Noctowl actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Bearing the dreaded plague of the early game bird, that of the bland normal flying typing and its associated ills, stats ranging from decent to poor and a desert dry move pool, Noctowl was on nobody's radar once you got past the in-game, and even there it had to compete with the Pidgeot line. Now, competitively speaking, Noctowl was quite distinct from Pidgeot, as well as the Fearow that outclassed Pidgeot and the Dodrio that outclassed Fearow. Whereas those three were offensively oriented, Noctowl packed excellent special bulk between its superb base 100 HP and base 96 special stat. This meant it was actually slightly specially bulkier than Raikou, one of the best special tanks in OU. Of course, Noctowl still had the aforementioned plague of the early game bird, so it wasn't OU or UU and even NU. It didn't really do much. That might be a bit harsh, as it actually did have a pretty good niche for its ability to withstand hits from threatening tier staples, Xatu and Octillery, while being spikes immune at that, and it could potentially pull off a decent sweeping set with Curse, Rest, and Sleep Talk alongside Stab Return. Even with this niche though, the fact was that Noctowl didn't actually do much. Rather than sweep, it would switch in, take a hit or two, rest up, and be forced out. It was so spectacularly unthreatening without boosting a lot, and it wouldn't be able to boost nearly as much as it needed until the very end of games, even against the immensely low power backdrop of GSC NU. As such, it wasn't going to be used on many teams, especially since fellow normal flying type Fearow was one of the best Pokemon around, but Noctowl had its small, legitimate place in the tier. Nothing earth-shattering, but considering it was, well, Noctowl, the fact that it even had a niche was a miracle. Noctowl knew it wouldn't get another opportunity like this, though. Its set of traits that was barely passable in Gen 2's lower tier would not survive the power creep of the coming generation. Noctowl was a forgettable Pokemon. There was no chance Game Freak was going to give it anywhere near what it needed, which was a lot. Noctowl wasn't just going to sit and take it, though. If Game Freak decided to make it so bland that nobody would notice it, Noctowl would take advantage. It'd take what it needed. It wasn't going to just sit on the sidelines generation after generation, watching as the best Pokemon got better, and as Game Freak's favorite darlings were selected to join them, Noctowl would get revenge. Imagine everyone's surprise when Game Freak buffed Noctowl to the point where it dominated not just OU, but Ubers too. That's what you expected, right? That's what you wanted to hear even. Some wacky feel-good tale of Noctowl receiving over-the-top superpowers from some whimsical, generous benefactor residing in some quirky, idiosyncratic location. Noctowl suddenly toppling Groudon and Kyogre with its new signature move, Aerodynamic Laser Blast, powered by cursed black fires of the deepest, darkest hell, received from the move tutor Prince of the Unfathomable Cosmos, whose entrance to dimensions incomprehensible can be found right next to the Pokemon Center in Sutopolis City. Yeah, nothing like that happens, kid. Noctowl's plight was real, and that made it scarier than all the eldritch horrors one could care to dream up. Nor did it have any such pretensions about how dirty it was going to have to get its wings if it was going to survive. Of course, if Noctowl was going to get rough, it wasn't going to be able to get by in so-called polite society anymore, but that was fine. It had no love for them. Anyway, the Blissies and the Skarmories, the Tyrantars and the Suicunes, with their vapid messages of kindness and a balanced metagame not but a thin, hypercritical veneer for the savagery and cruelty that lay beneath, the truth they'd never admit they wanted a game where Zapdos was always going to be the Wonder Bird, where they and the other superior OU Pokemon reigned unchallenged. They wanted Noctowl to sit down and shut up! Noctowl had a plan, but it would need some help. Surely another Pokemon dealt the same sadistic hand by Game Freak would be willing to join it. Sure, there was a risk, but what was the alternative? To get your hopes up with the coming release of a new generation only to be let down time and time again until your own existence could barely even be referred to as such that it was so numb? Someone else would have to be willing to forego their miserable, safe comfort in order to afford the basic dignity of really living, not just being. That someone was Radical. Raticate. Noctowl had always liked Raticate. It was hapless, but not for lack of trying. It was ferocious in attempt, in spirit, if not in effect. Noctowl also liked that Raticate was a normal type, just like itself. No fancy elemental powers helping it out, just a real Pokemon trying to get by, but stepped over, often stepped on, by any half-intelligent babyface lucky enough to be given a starter by Professor Oak and to survive a gym battle or two. Noctowl didn't love that Raticate was from Gen 1, but hey, it could get over that. They were neighbors after all, and Noctowl had to admit its fellow Gen 2 Pokemon could be snobs in their own right, even exempting the fact none of them had ever extended it so much as a helping finger, let alone a hand. The plan was simple. On Mount Pyre, there was said to be a bag guarded by 2 elders. Nobody knew what was in it for certain, only whispers of rumors seemingly more far-fetched than that other normal flying type. Who knew what awful fate had befallen that poor duck? But the elders were said to be on edge lately, for Team Magma and Team Aqua were apparently interested in the contents of that bag. Who knew why those morons wanted anything? What they would have wanted was a way to not get thrashed by 10-year-olds on the regular, but the fact that they wanted it, and the uncertainty and fear around them wanting it, meant many others wanted it too, and not just people. This was another ace up Noctowl's metaphorical sleeve. It was just a Pokemon, just used for people's battling, more or less a living tool, or so the people thought, seeing that's how they treated it anyway. Noctowl and Raticate would team up, steal the bag from the unsuspecting elders on Mount Pyre, and take it to the black market in other regions where such interested parties would pay through the roof for it. Noctowl and Raticate would never actually sell though, big as that payout might be. It wouldn't last. They'd take the money from their interested buyers and leave them, let's say, blacked out. Ethical? Of course not, but neither were their circumstances. Playing clean and by the rules would just dig them deeper in the hole they'd been thrown into to begin with. The heist itself was easy. Noctowl circled around the elders at first from an innocuous distance, but inching closer and closer every few minutes. Eventually the elders noticed and started looking up in concern, and there were no people around, and so they didn't notice Raticate had snatched the bag until Noctowl, in perfectly synchronized timing, swooped down, grabbed it, and carried it away. The tougher part was getting out of Hoenn. Word quickly got out, and soon the whole region was looking for them. It was only their head start and the decent speed of both Pokemon that let them make it to Sinnoh before anyone spotted them. Getting around Sinnoh was more treacherous than Hoenn on account of all the stealth rock floating around, but this was a fair price to pay for word of Noctowl and Raticate not having reached there yet, especially as Noctowl quickly learned to roost. It was easier than ever for Noctowl and Raticate to pass unnoticed. With power creep like this, nobody was ever going to think twice. Still, as they wandered the region, Noctowl, despite knowing it was doing what it needed to, felt an intense pang of wishing it could belong, alongside violent flares of jealousy whenever it saw Staraptor, a normal flying bird with amazing attack, great speed, and a 120 base power fighting move in close combat. Best bird, everyone called it. Hey, it's just not in the stars for Pokemon like me. Noctowl reminded itself in the midst of its regular self-assurances that this life was, in fact, better than that which had been laid out for it. Doubt cut both ways, but all in all, things weren't bad. It helped that Noctowl got along well with Raticate. At first, they didn't talk much, but they really became close after their first experience with some, interested customers. A group of particularly gullible galactic grunts whom were taken by surprise when, after handing over the money, got rushed themselves by Noctowl and Raticate and were taken out cold. Nobody was gonna notice or care about them. They weren't even smart enough to take out their own Pokemon. Easy money, and that kind of shared experience will bring you closer to someone. They even started enjoying pulling their routine on all sorts of unsuspecting goons, wiping the dumb, arrogant grins off their faces. And when the news of their exploits started reaching more ears and the heat started getting a little too hot, they simply made way for the next region. They were in the good old days, but they only knew it was because of the gnawing feeling those good old days were now more definitively numbered than they knew they were always going to be, on account of there being a professional snoop hanging around who decided to make their business his own. His name, Detective Looker, the kind of guy you can't help but wonder about. He's got to have some sort of screw loose to do what he does, even if he's well off and generally well liked by the public. What kind of lunatic wouldn't evolve his crow gunk after all? This lunatic was after them though, and he unfortunately knew enough to know where they were going next. Unova was a wild place, the kind that makes you fear for your soul as much as your physical well-being. And yet the scariest part of being there for Noctowl and Raticate was knowing there was a man hot on their heels, a man who knew about them and a man they couldn't sell to. They were pretty rich at this point, so they thought about hiring some protection, but who could they trust? These Unova types would flip the second Looker glanced at them. These riches weren't doing them too much good, well, other than the small creature comforts they had grown accustomed to, but ones they could sadly never settle down with, as they were always on the move. Plus, selling had become more and more difficult. They still didn't know what was in that bag, but it had begun to glow various menacing shades of red and blue, which was beginning to scare the buyers, as well as Noctowl and Raticate themselves. And then one day, as they were making their way down Route 18, Raticate disappeared. Noctowl didn't see or hear it happen. At one point, it simply realized Raticate wasn't there anymore. It didn't even steal the bag or anything, which was glowing more and more ominously by the day, no, by the hour, or any of the money. No, Raticate was just gone. This sudden disappearance into nothing with nary a reason or explanation was disquieting. The unnerving silence in the wake of this realization quickly erupted into high-strung nerves of terror as Noctowl realized it had been recognized and it was now alone. It took off for Kalos, the bag's glow now continuous, growing brighter and brighter. Noctowl had barely made it to Kalos when Looker finally caught up to it. It didn't even have time to get furious over all the mega evolutions being dished out to the usual suspects, the favorites. It registered in an instant as little more than a formality, just another indignity brutally contrasting the nasty end Noctowl knew was coming. Noctowl couldn't keep going. It stared, panting, as Looker, that awful righteous look on his face, Mr. Goodlaw, upholding everything for those on top, kicking those below for daring to ever venture from where they started and should have stayed, flanked by Krogung and its arrogant sneer, cornered it. They drew closer and closer, and as they did, their expressions became concerned because that bag was shining bright, impossibly so. Noctowl could barely even keep its eyes open, though it might have just been too exhausted. It'd be real nice if it could just lay down. And then the bag exploded. I guess Noctowl did get its superpowered ending after all. Just the sick, inverted version of it. Not the fantasy, but instead the nightmare, where it unleashed Primal Groudon and Kyogre on the 6th generation, leaving everyone swept away in their calamitous clash. Oh, you thought it would make it all the way to the current generation? I mean, the DLC just released it in Scarlet and Violet, but nah, it doesn't work like that. Not for Pokemon like Noctowl. And that's it. So how bad was Noctowl actually? Well, seeing as its competitive history since Gen 3 has been varying shades of it being among the worst, blandest Pokemon in the game, we decided to continue in our tradition of making a joke video about it. Except this time, we decided to illustrate Game Freak's cruelty towards the everyday Pokemon that suffer like this through a film noir style narrative. If ever a Pokemon deserved it, it's Noctowl. Hopefully Game Freak will do something to right the wrongs of the horrendous inequalities it's dished out on its own creations. And no, giving Noctowl 10 more base special attack and Hurricane in Gen 7 isn't enough. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you so much to the patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, how would you buff Noctowl? Go crazy. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.